Hello everyone and welcome back. Our third session for the day is a panel titled Migrations to the North, Forced Repatriations and the New Middle Passage. And it's a pleasure to welcome Zahid Chaudhary, Associate Professor of English at Princeton University, Ayesha Hameed, Artist and Senior Lecturer of Visual Cultures at Goldsmiths College, Bouchra Khalili, Artist and Head of Department of Artistic Strategies, who will join us via Zoom, and artist Rashid Qureshi. Our moderator is Awam Amkpa, Dean of Arts and Humanities at NYU Abu Dhabi. Each panelist will present first, followed by a panel and an audience Q&A. I would like now to hand over to Amkpa briefly. Awam, sorry.
Yes, hi. Good afternoon and welcome back to the conference. So this panel really takes us into a certain paradox. The celebrators, the honors, they put jewels around us, they bring us into hallowed halls, yet at the background there is a lot of xenophobia, racism, alienation, and so on. And various artists will not only comment on this paradox, also broadly contextualize their own work, etc., but would also give us as an audience an opportunity to engage with them one-on-one during the event and also after the event. You can mingle and so on. So without wasting a lot of time, I'll just ask Zahid to take us off. Yes.
Just press that. Okay, thank you. All right. I just want to thank the organizers for this invitation. It's a real honor to be a part of this conversation. So some of the things that I have to say today will sound familiar because we've had a couple of really great few panels on this already, on the problem of how art and politics articulate together. So as you just heard, our task for this particular panel is to consider the paradox of a sort of rise of ethno-nationalism, xenophobia, and anti-immigrant sentiment in Europe and North America that's happening at the same time as there's a sort of celebration of art from the global South. And so what I want to argue today is that this paradox is actually very generative for Europe and for North America. But what might seem to us at first as a kind of opposition or a contradiction actually turns out to be much more mutually reinforcing as an opposition. If you consider that this paradox is that's one produced by neoliberalism itself, that it's actually central to the way neoliberalism works. So the resurgence of ethno-nationalism and xenophobia in Europe and North America is constitutively related to neoliberal policies that not only strip workers protections, but also the protections of citizenship. And Professor Gayatri Spivak alluded to this in her keynote today. And so these protections of citizenship, which were never entirely in place for some populations, as we know, are done in the service of the flows of capital. So this kind of neoliberal erosion of citizenship happens across the board now. It affects actually poor white people as well as people of color. But still, the social contract whereby the state putatively offers protection and security in return for obedience to the rule of law, this was always a liberal fantasy. And it was never quite working for certain people. So neoliberalism in Europe and North America assures that poor white citizens now face forms of precarity and insecurity that had previously been a regular feature of the lives of racialized citizens. So contemporary celebrations of diversity, multiculturalism, pluralism, as one of our questioners referred to these terms earlier this morning as sort of neoliberal terms, and they very much are, the celebrations of diversity are ways of acknowledging racial, cultural, and historical difference while actually denying the structural, material, and conflictual aspects of these very differences. And I just want to share this quote from Roderick Ferguson, where he writes, liberal multiculturalism would signal the moment in which state and capital would use anti-racism to forestall the redistribution of resources to economic and racially disenfranchised communities. So diversity, he says, arose as a way of preempting redistribution. So this is very important to remember, that the discourse on diversity actually preempts redistribution, making the hegemonic institutions not only part of an affirmation, but a preemption as well. So these sort of celebrations of art from the global south that we're seeing these days, these affirmations and recuperation of diverse voices, festivals of art from the global south, under the mantle of pluralism and multiculturalism, is, in other words, if we're following Ferguson's logic, itself a form of hegemonic regulation. So the inclusion of diverse artists and the closure of borders, I want to argue, are, through Ferguson, these two oppositions are the two branchings of ultimately the same political economic rationality. So in addition, if we consider that art itself has always followed the circuits of capital, long before neoliberalism, and this is something we all know as people engage with the arts, the art has this history of following the relations of domination and power. So if we consider that history of art, then our apparent paradox actually reveals itself as a key material contradiction that's in fact taking a historically specific form in our times. So it is precisely because art and monetary power, and by extension, I would say art and domination, have had a mutually reinforcing relationship with each other, is why Theodor Adorno could speak of what he called art's guilty conscience. So art's own history is intimately woven through forms of patronage, authority, and domination. And at the very same time, these very forms, and this is the double bind, these very forms are the conditions of art's possibility. That without this intimacy with power, there's less opportunity for creating art. Okay? So aesthetic autonomy has always had to contend with the constraints of this double bind, and the artists all over the world find themselves in this exact double bind. So just to be clear, what I'm saying is that when we discuss the place of art with respect to contemporary global flows of capital and the resurgence of ethno-nationalist ideologies around the world, we're dealing with actually two paradoxes, not just one. There's the first one that this panel is about, the celebration of diversity that happens with the rise of xenophobia. And secondly, I want to add to that the fact of art's age-old entwinement with hegemonic power. So put this way, it seems even less surprising that art's long-standing intimacy with patronage, capital, and domination would make it a privileged object for staging diversity, plurality, and inclusiveness, precisely to help preempt questions of redistribution and the erosion of citizenship and the protections it once conferred. So while it is true that the celebration of artists from the global south happens in elite enclaves, and are part and parcel of upper-class refinement, and that these elite spaces are governed by a different set of rules, set of rules and priorities than the calculus of bodily risk. As a source and standard of truth affects the so-called truth in art that all of us gathered here seek to discover. We wouldn't have traveled all these miles to come here if we weren't in some way invested in some notion of a truth in art. And I'm trying to figure out, how does the truth of the market affect now what we consider to be the truth in art? So first, to explain what I mean by the market being the source of truth. That what I'm referring to is that the market is increasingly seen as a source of valediction for neoliberal thinking and neoliberal practice. Michel Foucault wrote about this a long time ago. He explained that under neoliberalism, and I quote, inasmuch as prices are determined in accordance with the natural mechanism of the market, they constitute a standard of truth. So prices constitute a standard of truth in the market, and that enables, he continues, enables us to discern which governmental practices are correct and which are erroneous. So what Foucault's getting at is that what the market becomes, once you start thinking of the market truth as the ultimate truth, governance itself attunes itself to the truth of the market. Okay? So the market comes to condition governmental action. So the market provides a truth on the basis of which governance occurs. The government does not become a market, but rather the government becomes the market's steward and relies on market's forms of valediction. The truth tellers of the market, economists, suddenly become central to the art of governance. And consulting the ideally autonomous and self-regulating market, this is the neoliberal fantasy about the market, that emanates truth, these economists offer pronouncements that determine the kind of life that the people under the government will lead. So these techniques of governance were practiced. So here I want to make the point that actually even neoliberal thinking itself was very much invested in the history of sort of long distance, well, there's colonialism, but there's also economic imperialism. So these techniques of neoliberal governance were actually practiced in Africa and Latin America before they were mainstreamed in Europe and the United States. So this rationality, which is now global, began, as many things did, like, for example, concentration camps, not in Europe, but in other places. As Quinn Slobodian has argued, the high priests of neoliberalism, Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman, and Wilhelm Röpke, these guys viewed decolonization, and this is in 1947, they're having a conference in Geneva about neoliberal thinking. The first meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society happens in 1947, so right at the height of the struggles for decolonization. So these neoliberals viewed decolonization as a profound threat to capitalist accumulation. So of the three of them, Röpke was basically unreconstructed racist. He argued in favor of apartheid because, in his words, the South African Negro was, he argued, not of a different race, and I quote, a completely different type and level of civilization, end quote. So while Hayek and Friedman did not endorse this variety of racism, they too argued against the demands for equality between the races when such a demand required the redistribution of property in the decolonizing world. Hayek even opposed sanctions against apartheid, and he would only support black majority rule as long as post-colonial state institutions were stripped of their power to regulate the economy. Milton Friedman defended white majority rule in Rhodesia. Neoliberalism, that was, as you can see, neoliberalism was global right at the outset in terms of the way it conceived of the economy, presumed that the economy itself was not political, and it sought to protect the economy from this kind of politicization, the politicization known as decolonization. And in turn, they rendered the global and local racial inequalities that the market generates into natural laws. So all of those inequalities that the market has generated have become the truth once you take neoliberal thinking into practice. And that is the truth on which governance will occur. So this is what I mean by market truth, okay? So how does this kind of truth affect the production of art now and the truth in art? So first thing, the neoliberal assumption that the economy is the site of valediction has to be challenged on all political fronts. And maybe art has a role to play in this. I'll get to that in a minute. So especially as this assumption naturalizes capitalism's race and class arrangements. So insofar as art institutions benefit from the neoliberal encasing of capital flows, such that the state's newfound functions are to serve these flows over and above serving their citizens, the truth in art is no longer dissociable completely from the truths that the market generates. So, of course, I'm not saying here that the truth in art is reducible to market truth. That's not what I'm saying. But that the challenges that market truth and neoliberal governance pose to the function of art, these challenges are worth considering and worth parsing. So in the rest of the talk, I'm just going to go over briefly how some artists have engaged this kind of double bind of art now. So how have artists responded to these intractable realities? One response is to reinvent documentary practices, drawing on the histories of forced migration, racialized violence, and the archives of repatriation and migrant stories. So art becomes, in these practices, a mode of recovery or reinvention or recording. And here's an example from Carrie Mae Weems. She has a series entitled "From Here I Saw What Happened and I Cried," and she takes photographs from the history of racial subjection and she reactivates them. She puts a filter on them, puts images on. So there's a way of re-narrating a kind of racial past, a racial history, and rethinking solidarity through that. So here we have a technique of kind of recovery, recuperation, returning to the archive for the possibilities of for the present. So that's one option of thinking about the strange place that art inhabits now and the truth that art might have to offer. Another option is for artists to actually return to the venerable modernist posture of self-referentiality, making the double binds of the artwork itself a subject of the art. So in this way, some contemporary artists have actually rescued modernist art practice from the solipsism that at least in my opinion, modernist art can fall into. And this kind of strategy reorients the art's self-reflexivity, or self-referentiality, toward the social relations that made it possible. And I'll just give you an example here. This is a series by Hardeep Bandal. He's a UK-based artist, and so his version of self-referentiality actually takes the form of critical irony in this series. This series is called the Lord Tebbit series, and Norman Tebbit was a conservative lawmaker, most well known for what he referred to as his cricket test, which was a way of figuring out whether immigrants were loyal to England or not. So he tried to figure out the extent of a brown or black citizen's loyalty to England by gauging their loyalty to English cricket teams. So the artist Bundle, he takes these cricket jumpers and reworks them with aggressive motifs that could only seem rude to the cultural and political sensibility of the Lord Tebbits of the world. Here it is in a gallery. So these jumpers are a defiant celebration of the unassimilated migrant. They also are immigrant. They also recall the punk aesthetic made high fashion by Vivienne Westwood in the 1980s, a kind of rebel yell, a kind of going against the grain aesthetic that actually became an ornament for the elite. So what I'm arguing here is that Bundle, in a very self-referential way, takes this cultural and sartorial history of Britain, and these pieces draw attention to the uncertain status of their defiance in the space of an art gallery. So while they're interruptive, while they're trying to subvert something like a cricket jumper, at the same time, they're very much a part of this other tradition of subversion that's already co-opted. So another contemporary artist, Walid Raad, uses both recording and documentation alongside self-referential techniques. And in his work, he combines these two strategies. On the one hand, documenting and relying on an archive and research, and taking an investigative approach to figuring out what the artwork can do, and also self-referentiality, reinventing modernist self-referentiality to investigate the problem of truth in art. So in one installation, he researched a very specific opportunity that was presented to him as an artist, in which he discovered, upon investigating it, that there was a web of financial and governmental relationships involving weapons markets, surveillance capitalism, border regimes, and pension funds. So this led Walid Raad to describe his project. He has a description of this project, and he says that his investigation led him to look into technological innovations in the area of statistics, risk management concepts in finance, art as an alternative asset class, culture as an engine of economic growth in the Arab world and elsewhere, text, data mining, and face recognition algorithms, end quote. So all of these different kinds of practices, institutions, and in financial networks are synced together in this opportunity that was created for him as an artist. And here's a piece that emerged from that investigation. So he maps out these connections in an elaborate display with flowcharts, animations, and projections that trace the links among individual investors, associated corporations, and industries, and particular governments. And so this is not animated, but when you see this piece, it's sort of life-size. It's actually bigger than most people. It's about 7 foot tall, and the projections and animations they move across. And so there's a lot of detail in this piece. So he produced an artwork that explains how a small fragment of the contemporary art production, the small opportunity he was given for his art, is implicated in economies that support all kinds of global repression. And here are just some details of what you see on the board. And there's a whole global network of nations involved in this opportunity if you just follow the money. So the artist imagined this display as a stage set, he called it, in front of which he would give an oral presentation. So this installation, it's premised on the very possibility of pedagogy and of teaching. Okay? As such, the piece has a pedagogical premise, but what it has to teach, and this is one of its ironies, that what it has to teach cannot be fully mastered. You can never know the entirety of this network that the piece is trying to represent. So standing in front of the piece, the more one inspects the display, the more granular and overwhelming the connections between art and domination become. In this way, the artwork actually re-energizes the powers of the sublime. A single fragment of art's exchange offers a look into a startling mise en abîme of racial capitalism's forms of creative destruction. And so I will just conclude by saying that I present these very different examples of artists' critical engagements with the unconscionable conditions that make art possible, not as examples of art's redemptive power. So I don't want to say that because these artists can do these great things with their artworks, it's fine, that art has freed itself from its material conditions. Precisely the opposite. What I'm saying is that what makes these different artworks powerful is their illumination of the world, of history, and of global social relations as being unredeemed. So in the rest of this panel, what we're going to hear are about more aesthetic strategies, I hope, that's oriented precisely toward these social relations that are unredeemed and possibly unredeemable. So finally, the truth in art, then, cannot reveal the truth of the market as a lie. It's not enough for artwork to say that the market truth is a lie, because art itself depends on the very same game of truth as the market. But what art can do is that it can bring into sharper relief the contradictions out of which art itself is created. Thank you.
Thank you, Zahid.
So hello everyone. I'm really happy to be here in such wonderful company and to be part of the timely and important conversations taking place during this March meeting. I also want to send a special shout out to the translators and thank them for all their invisible but very audible labor. I'm going to talk about 2 projects. The first, Black Atlantis, that is winding down, and a second called Brown Atlantis, which I started in 2020. So Black Atlantis traces afterlives of transatlantic slavery in the present, making connections to illegalized migrations on the Mediterranean Sea, while Brown Atlantis connects transatlantic slavery to the Indian Ocean world and histories of indentureship, looking at the intertwinement of black and brown bodies and exploring afterlives in the present moment. In both projects, I use the image of an underwater Atlantis at the bottom of both the Atlantic and Indian Oceans to explore a set of speculative fictions. I use this alternate world to connect histories of slavery and indenture to the present and to make sense of migratory movements today. An underwater Atlantis also calls attention to the materiality of the oceans as living environments and how subaquatic human life might adapt, eroding the division between humans and non-humans. So the speculations of a brown and black Atlantis are simultaneously explorations of a watery Anthropocene. So my project Black Atlantis, which I started in 2014, is a series of published texts, lecture performances, films, and sound works that look at the Black Atlantic and its afterlives in contemporary illegalized migration in the Mediterranean, in oceanic environments, through Afrofuturistic dance floors and sound systems, and in outer space. Using Walter Benjamin's concept of the dialectical image, I examine how to think through sound, image, water, violence, and history as elements of an active archive, and of time travel as a historical method. Black Atlantis combines two discourses, Afrofuturism and the Anthropocene. It follows a comment made by the geographer Phil Stenberg, who talked about how the Black Atlantic as a discourse runs the danger of running at the surface of the ocean, and as a result, the depth of the ocean is lost, and therefore its haptic, tactile quality, its wetness is lost. What below the water and Atlantis brings back is the bottom of the sea, the volume of the water, and the space of the ocean and other protagonists that inhabit the sea. One of the chapters in this project is a video called À l'ombre de nos fantômes, or In the Shadow of Our Ghosts, that I made with the Mauritanian and Senegalese artist Hameed Khan for the 2018 Dakar Biennial. The film is in part about a ship that sailed in 2006 from Cape Verde to the Canary Islands, but was found off the coast of Barbados months later. The film, or the video I should say, also partly refers to Hameed's own experience of the time of walking across the Sahara Desert before crossing and claiming asylum in Europe several years ago. So I'm going to play a short clip of the film. There should be sound.
Maulisu, Mamiwata, Yemonja, Kwiti Kwiti, Mboze, Makanga, Bunzi, Kambisi, Moana, Madre de Agua, Yemania, La Sirène, Madame Poisson, Mamba Muntu, Maman de l'eau, Maman de l'eau, Maman de l'eau.
The soul, the water and the sun, both destroyed and preserved the bodies of these 11 men huddled together in the cabin.
Mama Dino.
But they are a small fraction of the 40-odd men they set off with, who died and were washed overboard into the sea.
Maman de l'eau. Watra Mama.
Through this, those bodies become something else. The forces of the sea, its salt water, wind, and sun corrugate and engulf them.
River Maiden.
They make the bodies a part of the ravages of the sea and connect them to the others not seen that fell into the ocean. The sea, a force, fossilizes the bodies of these men who died on board, destroying and preserving them. The force of the sea winds and weather is insidious and complicit in the transformation of these dead men into fossils of the sea. They have become a part of the archive of sea, understandable in part only through the sea.
Water mama. Watra mama. Maman de l'eau. Mama de l'eau. Maman de l'eau. Maman de l'eau. Mama glow.
My new project is called Brown Atlantis. And like I said before, it extends the geography of Black Atlantis from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. Brown Atlantis looks at the Indian and Atlantic Oceans together as a site of both indentured and enslaved labor, and the imbrication in what Ruha Benjamin calls the technology of race. Brown Atlantis builds on Black Atlantis to study marine ecology, Afrofuturist sorry, I'm also very jet-lagged, Afrofuturist imageries of underwater adaptation and technologies of navigation in a different configuration of the weather that takes into account the uniqueness of the Indian Ocean's trade winds and south-south. The installation moves this history underwater, taking us to battles against forces of the seafloor, through the fragile nervousness of cable signals, and to the forests in Sarawak, from where gutta percha was extracted by indigenous peoples to insulate the thousands of miles of undersea cables. I Sing of the Sea considers how communication can act as a kind of violence, transmitted across the sea floor, consolidating Britain's imperial control over India. If Imperial Britain was the mother country and its colonies its offspring, then the undersea cable was a kind of pathological, strangulating umbilical cord. What I'm trying to do is tell a subaquatic story of these offspring. Audio. Can you turn the audio? Sorry, I'm just going to rewind so you can get the audio again. Is it on? I'm just going to wait, I'm afraid, because the audio is sort of important for this. There should be audio in this clip. Thank you.
Tawa roasted into chapati, from hand to hand, trembling, dawning revolt, 1857. Camel dung, smoke signals, rumors, rustles. It took 6 weeks. It took 6 weeks.
For news to travel, to control.
And so the wire electric, standing at the gallows, he calls the telegraph the noose that blocked the breath of revolt. It took 6 weeks. And so his neck broken, and another head in England grows cables like tentacles, singing the bottom of the sea. I sing the body electric. I sing the whispers gone quiet.
In 1870, telegraph cables connected India to Britain, turning 6 weeks into 9 minutes, flashing gold on the ocean floor, snaking dots and dashes.
Through forests I sing of fallen trees and crushed sedition.
What I was trying to do with this piece was sort of think about how there's a kind of prehistory to the global circulation of information, extractivism, goods, movements of people. There's different time scales also, I think, of the circulation of information through rumors and chapatis, the way in which ships were transmitting important information from the perspective of the state, and then the implementation of the telegraph. I feel like what I was trying to do is highlight which parts of the world are extracted from and their clash with different epistemic and spiritual relationships to nature that come into play. Amplifying this, or thinking about this idea of sound, I've recently started a radio show called Radio Brown Atlantis, and thinking about the kind of question of the intertwinement of communication and oceanic space. This show is broadcast on the Onassis Foundation's Movement Radio and Radio Al-Hara in Palestine. In each episode, I invite practitioners in the field of sonic art, music, and performative thought from different parts of the Indian Ocean and Atlantic Ocean worlds to basically have a jam session on what a brown Atlantis might look or sound like. We play music, read poetry, tell stories, and see where the conversation takes us. In collaboration with the guests that I had from the first season, we are putting together an exhibition at the Bonniers Constal, which is taking as its premise that a brown Atlantis is cartographically unmappable, and that the sounds and textures of an improvisational radio show cannot fully be made visible. But the reason why I sort of thought to include this is trying to think through how migrations in the Indian Ocean world are in parallel, or how they work in tandem, or how they are connected to legacies of transatlantic slavery. And also thinking about this kind of circulation as a kind of undoing of sort of dominant narratives of cosmopolitanism. So thinking about cosmopolitanism at sea level, the exchange of ideas, songs, cultures, versus the kind of economic flows that are state-run or from above. And thinking also just the form of radio as a kind of means with which to amplify this already existing cosmopolitanism. So I was thinking, just to wind up, I wanted to play a few excerpts from a couple of the shows. The first is a conversation I had with Cynthia Mohini Sampson, an artist who is based in Australia. No sound again, sorry.
My family were taken from South India, from the port of, what was then called Madras, then taken to Natal, which is now KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. And then from there, they were sent to sugar plantations to work. There was industries of fishing and many different forms of labour, not just the sugar industries there. But obviously, they were taking people to work on, sugar colonies, cheap labour. And then my mother was brought up during apartheid in South Africa, and she actually left on the last South African Airways flight from South Africa to Australia during apartheid. So there's that. I I think, and I was sort of born here, and I think being aware of something really that wasn't discussed a lot of this history, a lot of shame surrounding this history with our people not telling these stories or telling them very secretly. And this, I think, was really brought to the forefront for my mother and myself when I was just making work trying to understand my relationship with my mother, the experiences my family had experiencing racism in Australia, experiences of sort of not belonging and being displaced, and this idea of intergenerational trauma. Because I sort of, what happened to these women? They all had these parallel experiences, through each generation of women. And there's just something that's being passed down. Like, there's that culture, there's some incredible, amazing things that are being passed down with the women, but there's these cultural expectations from a place that we're disconnected from, but we're always part of. But also there's sort of this trauma, or there was this other thing, mental illness, or there was this sort of part of it that I didn't understand, and that picture wasn't fully there for me.
The second excerpt I'm going to play is from a conversation I had with Shudhabrata Sengupta from Rux Media Collective.
What I was really thinking about, one thing that sort of got stuck in my head in the last few days was thinking about, the ways in which water and images of what bodies of water get mobilized within political discourses, but also that they're not just metaphors, they actually are quite literal. So what got stuck in my head just, in the kind of the last week was this chant that you hear at all the demos in the last week, which is from the river to the sea. I'm thinking about this imaginary of a Palestinian homeland that would actually encompass the borders of the River Jordan to the Mediterranean, and this is not a rhetorical thing. So I was thinking about that image, or that mobilization, because it's very powerful to hear it from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And then, of course, thinking about the Ganga and the sort of slowly, like it's almost like this slow car crash of watching the Kumbh Mela sort of take place and knowing all the kinds of the casualties that would happen. And of course, the same, like almost like the violence of a Benjaminian dialectical image of like people worshipping at the Ganga and then dying, and then people who've died, whose bodies have then been thrown. So I feel like there's something about these two bodies of water from the river to the sea as a kind of defiance against this horrific sort of flattening that we've seen in the last 10 days or so, and then this sort of image of death and how it's slowly unfolded in a way that everybody could have predicted, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the slogan "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free" has been in all our minds in the last week or so, or even before that. I mean, I've always, whenever the word Palestine comes up, sort of unspoken is the "from the river to the sea," and I've always thought of that as something not just about Palestine, but it actually describes a way of inhabiting the world, which is between different kinds of flows and currents. So if there's a riverine flow and then there's a maritime current. The Ganga images that we see are actually now of two kinds. There are bodies that have been floated in the river. And then there are burials by the riverside in the sand, which is people who cannot afford to build funeral pyres who are digging them shallow graves in the sand. And as the wind and the river actually acts upon the riverbank, these burials are getting exposed. So there's that remarkable image that I saw again today of a man walking. So it's taken from a drone. You can see one man walking on the riverbank. It's grey sand. There's a tiny figure, and there are these little rectangular patches which are the bodies that have become sort of half uncovered because of the action of the wind. And the fact that, you know, the river becomes like a resting place for people, which is both an extremely touching and a poignant thing, but also incredibly dangerous, because these are all, again, vectors of infection.
I'm out of time, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Ayesha. We're going to have Bouchra Khalili, who's going to be zooming. Perhaps just to prevent stiff necks, we can just take a chairs to the side. So now we're going to go to a dear friend, great artist, Rashid Qureshi. Rashid will be speaking in French. There are headphones if you want to translate. Wait.
Présence d'abord. Je vais vous présenter en français parce que malheureusement mon arabe il est pas bon, il existe mais n'est pas très bon. En anglais rien, donc voilà, on va partir comme ça. Je ne vais pas vous présenter mon travail en tant qu'artiste, malheureusement parce que les circonstances sont tellement différentes. Je vais vous présenter un de mes projets de cimetière parce que ça c'est pas malheureusement le premier. J'en avais fait un en 2005 déjà au château d'Amboise, qui était le château du roi François Ier, et qui est juste collé à la tombe de Leonardo de Vinci, qui est enterré donc dans le château d'Amboise en France. Ça, donc c'était le premier. Le second, j'y travaille depuis 2000, pratiquement le début des années, pratiquement maintenant 25 ans, disons. 25 ans. C'est un cimetière qui est toujours dans l'état de fosse commune, qui est sur une île qui fait partie des 3 îles qui sont en face des villes de Cannes et de Nice, s'appelle l'île Sainte-Marguerite, où il y a pratiquement 1500 cadavres d'Algériens, de résistants, qui ont été pour beaucoup mis là dans les années donc 1830 jusqu'en 45, et après deuxième révolte contre la colonisation française en 1870 de l'émir Mokarani. Là aussi il y a d'autres otages qui ont été mis là, donc des fosses communes, et il y a eu 3 générations de naissance sur cette île, et donc personne n'a vu la vie autrement qu'en dehors de cette île. Donc c'est terrible. On est en train maintenant de débloquer un peu la situation. Peut-être dans 1 an, 2 ans, 3 ans maximum, je pense, je finirai par faire aussi un lieu de dignité pour ces résistants qui sont dans une fosse commune depuis donc 1 siècle et demi maintenant. Actuellement, bon, tout le monde sait la situation qui existe dans la Méditerranée, qui est très difficile, très complexe, et en même temps, malheureusement, une fois de plus, c'est dû à l'Occident. Donc, pour parler plus clairement, ça a été l'invasion de la Libye, l'assassinat du président Kadhafi, donc par des personnes qui se passent tout le temps, comme d'habitude, des démocrates, des gens ouverts, des gens de gauche, etc., mais qui ont massacré ce chef d'État, ils ont massacré le pays, et aujourd'hui, le pays est dans un état de catastrophe absolue. Donc nous, on nous parle simplement des migrants qui viennent par la mer. Moi, je suis d'Algérie, ma famille est dans le désert. Je peux vous dire qu'il y a aussi plein de naufragés du désert dont personne ne parle ou presque pas. Parce que les marchands aussi de traversées vendent des traversées par les camions. Donc c'est des gens qui viennent de beaucoup de pays enclavés au sud de l'Afrique, donc qui remontent totalement, qui passent par le désert algérien. Il suffit simplement que 2 pneus soient explosés, il suffit qu'il y ait une bielle qui est coulée, il suffit qu'il y ait un problème technique et on abandonne le camion parce que les gens qui font les sorties à travers le désert, ils ont des 4x4 derrière et devant. Ceux qui sont devant, c'est alerte s'il y a des barrages de police ou de gendarmerie. Ceux qui sont derrière voient ce qu'il y a derrière aussi. Une fois qu'il y a un problème technique très lourd, ils abandonnent les familles, les camions, ils partent avec leur 4x4 et on retrouve des mois après des squelettes dans des camions accumulés les uns sur les autres. Ça, peu de gens formalisent ça et on parle. Et on a beaucoup malheureusement. Donc moi, j'ai découvert un lieu au sud de la Tunisie, dans le golfe de Gabès, donc près du golfe de Gabès, dans une ville qui s'appelle Jargis, qui est juste après l'île de Djerba. Et le problème sur ce lieu, c'est qu'il y a un courant marin qui ramasse et qui ramène les cadavres sur cette ville spécifiquement. Le plus, il y en a un peu à Homosouk, donc à Djerba, dans la zone, mais le plus gros arrive par ces canaux de courant marin qui livrent des cadavres entiers. Rien qu'hier, et il y a 2-3 jours, pareil, on a eu 35 morts, plus 40 morts, et puis aussi un bateau qui avait coulé totalement la quille vers l'extérieur. Donc, et là récemment, il y a eu des tempêtes, et il y a des cadavres qui sont remontés par morceaux, vraiment découpés par morceaux, jusqu'à l'eau. Et ça nous pose de gros problèmes de les enterrer, comment les enterrer, de quelle manière le faire. Donc, moi, ma fille travaille à Londres, Action contre la faim. Elle m'avait averti en 2018 qu'il y a une décharge publique au sud de la Tunisie dans laquelle il y a plein de cadavres. J'ai pas pu le croire. Je lui ai dit, écoute, c'est impossible. Ça ne peut pas exister, non seulement dans un pays musulman, et surtout moi, en Tunisie. J'ai appelé le président du Croissant Rouge, donc de l'île, de Jargis, qui s'appelle Moujislim, qui est un pharmacien, un homme formidable, qui depuis déjà beaucoup d'années, donc faisait aussi partie des gens qui ramassaient les cadavres donc au bord de la mer, qui malheureusement n'ayant pas de lieu, donc puisque la population ne veut pas du tout que son cimetière soit complètement encombré, refuse totalement qu'il y ait des morts enterrés là-bas. Donc problème, c'est qu'il n'y a pas de solution. Ils les prennent par des camions, et les camions poubelles malheureusement, et ils sont jetés dans cette décharge. Ça paraît terrible, mais ça existe. Donc moi, vivant en Tunisie, mes ancêtres sont venus dans ce pays au 7e siècle, donc ont construit la ville de Kerouan, il y a leur cimetière collé à la mosquée, Koraichi, le cimetière de Koraichi, et par la suite ma famille est descendue plus au sud et est rentrée dans le désert algérien. Voilà notre arrivée de la Mecque au 7e siècle. Ce qui fait que j'ai un lien très fort, très puissant avec ce pays, et donc j'ai décidé d'acheter et de réaliser un cimetière. C'est le seul cimetière privé au monde qui existe. Enfin, vous savez tous, dans toutes les villes du monde, que ce soit aux États-Unis, au Canada et ailleurs, tous les cimetières passent par les villes, les cités, les maires, et naturellement les autorisations des préfets, des maires, du procureur de la République et des médecins légistes. Donc ça a été vraiment, j'ai acheté un terrain, moi je ne pouvais pas personnellement, j'ai pas la nationalité française, tunisienne, mais par contre, nationalité algérienne, ça a été ma fille, dont sa maman est tunisienne. On a acheté en son nom un grand terrain et j'ai lancé tout de suite la construction du lieu sans demander aucune autorisation. Je dis bien aucune jusqu'à la seconde où je vous parle. C'était une telle colère que je m'étais dit, le premier qui vient me prendre la tête avec des problèmes administratifs, je ne sais pas ce que je vais lui faire. Donc voilà, je vais vous présenter un lieu très particulier, je l'ai dessiné totalement, je l'ai financé à 100%, donc il n'y a pas un centime qui est venu de quiconque. Ça, je vous le dis d'une manière très importante, parce que quand on veut, si on ne donne pas la dignité aux morts, on ne la donnera jamais aux vivants. Et tout ce qui se passe, les événements actuels, nous ferons tous réfléchir pour ça. Je ne fais pas de différence. Dans ce lieu, il y a les Nations Unies. Il y a même dernièrement beaucoup, malheureusement, de gens du Pakistan et du Bangladesh qui arrivent jusqu'en Tunisie, morts, naturellement. Vous me direz comment ils sortent du Pakistan là, mais ils viennent en fait d'un pays pas très loin qui construit des stades et c'est des gens qui fuient là justement le système donc de construction de ces stades pour la coupe de football et qui se sauvent, n'ayant plus leur papier d'identité, prennent des bateaux et se retrouvent morts là-bas. Il y a des Tunisiens, très rares, mais aucun dans le cimetière. Ceux-là, ils vont dans le cimetière municipal, mais par contre, il y a des gens il y a des Palestiniens, il y a eu beaucoup de Syriens au moment de la guerre de Syrie, il y a beaucoup de gens, donc il y a quelques Marocains, des jeunes Marocains qui viennent en touristes vers la Tunisie et qui essayent de fuir aussi, mais il y a surtout des gens du Mali, du Niger, de la Sierra Leone, etc., etc. Donc voilà, il y a beaucoup de monde malheureusement. Et ce cimetière, il a aussi pour particularité, il n'y a aucune différence entre les chrétiens, les musulmans, les bouddhistes et autre chose, donc tous sont enterrés de la même manière, pas de différence, pas de carré musulman, de carré chrétien, tout le monde est au même stade. Voilà, ça a été inauguré le 9 juin de l'année dernière, donc par la directrice générale de l'UNESCO. Donc c'est protégé maintenant par l'UNESCO. On est en train de travailler avec la Fondation Arène aussi, donc possibilité. Et puis, bon, récemment, j'étais à New York pour mon propre projet d'artiste. Et là, il y a aussi les universités de Harvard, celles de Columbia, etc., qui sont en train de s'intéresser à voir de quelle manière aussi faire une protection à long terme. Bon, je ne vais pas prendre la parole longuement comme ça. Je vous passe les images et puis on va essayer d'avancer image par image. Voilà, vous voyez, on a démarré le 27-12, donc 2018. Alors, ça, c'est la photo de mon frère aîné. Parce que je me suis posé la question, pourquoi j'ai fait un cimetière? Pourquoi voulu avoir enterré des gens de cette manière et chaque fois de le faire? Ça, c'est un frère qui a disparu en mer en Algérie, dans la même Méditerranée, dès le début de l'indépendance. On n'avait même pas une année de différence, un peu comme des jumeaux, et on n'a jamais retrouvé le corps. Ça a été une douleur absolue pour ma mère, sur son lit de mort. Elle disait, merci mon Dieu de me prendre maintenant. Enfin, je vais retrouver mon fils. Donc cette douleur-là, je la sens pour toutes les mères, toutes les mamans et toutes les familles de ces morts et de ces disparus. Et vous voyez le document à côté, quand mes parents sont morts, pour des problèmes d'héritage, ça a été impossible de dénouer l'histoire. Il a fallu faire avec la mairie un faux extrait de décès, un faux constat de décès qui a été fait simplement, il est disparu en 64, mais le document, on l'a fait beaucoup plus tard pour pouvoir voir avec le notaire, et il y a eu des témoins qui ont fait de faux témoignages pour dire on a assisté à sa mort, il est mort à la maison tranquillement, alors qu'on n'a jamais retrouvé le corps. Voilà, alors là, c'est le fameux qu'on appelle cimetière d'inconnus. Depuis 2003, il y a des cadavres qui sont dessus. En fait, ce n'est pas un cimetière, c'est la décharge publique. Vous allez voir les détails par la suite. Voilà la décharge. Voilà les tombes qui sont dessus. Et encore, on a rajouté du sable. Sinon, le camion les jetait de la même manière qu'il jette les déchets donc, au quotidien. Alors, j'ai acheté ce terrain, vous voyez, c'est un terrain superbe, un terrain très propre, avec beaucoup d'oliviers dessus. Le bâtiment, vous voyez derrière, reçoit les migrants qui arrivent survivants. Donc, ils sont logés là par l'Organisation mondiale de la migration. Donc, ce qui fait que j'ai fait travailler beaucoup de migrants vivants pour enterrer leurs frères, pour leur donner de l'argent, pour leur permettre aussi de vivre la période où ils sont. Voilà, je suis le président du Croissant Rouge. Vous voyez les bornes blanches qu'à tous les côtés, c'est la limitation du terrain. Et je suis en train de lui montrer le plan que j'ai fait pour réaliser ce lieu. Alors voilà les dessins, les esquisses, avec en haut les formes de tombes que je voulais faire. Vous verrez par la suite le détail des tombes pour les jeunes femmes, les jeunes filles, les jeunes femmes, celles des femmes qui ont eu des enfants, celles des hommes et des enfants. Là, sur le dessin du bas, la grande porte d'entrée que vous verrez finie après, et au fond, c'est une salle de prière qui est ouverte à toutes les religions. Voilà, là, c'est les entrées du soleil. L'idée, c'est d'avoir de la lumière qui rentre de tous les côtés de la salle, donc de prière ou de méditation. C'est un jardin très végétalisé. L'idée, ça a été de reprendre des textes aussi bien de l'Ancien Testament, Nouveau Testament et le Coran qui parlent un peu des jardins du paradis. Voilà, alors là, c'est la décharge. Je suis en train, la mairie récemment, donc il y a 3 mois, me l'a remise avec un document, comme quoi elle est entre mes mains, que je m'en occupe. Donc je suis en train de la nettoyer, partie par partie, parce que c'est une montagne qui est énorme. Voilà, on est en train de faire des piquets pour faire les grillages, pour empêcher les chiens, les hyènes et les... Voilà, là, on est en chantier, le début du chantier. Et vous voyez sur le mur d'enceinte, j'ai mis des fenêtres toutes ouvertes parce qu'il y a des champs d'oliviers tout autour. Et l'idée, c'est que le cimetière respire. L'idée, c'est qu'il ne faut pas clore de nouveau comme la tombe le lieu pour que les âmes puissent rentrer et sortir librement. C'est une symbolique mystique. Donc, voilà les fenêtres qui sont dessus. Là, c'est un grenadier. Vous voyez ce qu'on voit un peu les champs autour. Là, je suis en train de travailler avec un atelier d'ébénisterie dans la Médina de Tunis pour travailler en marqueterie, les différentes portes du lieu, les fenêtres, etc. J'ai fait travailler beaucoup de corps de métier, les céramistes, les ferronniers, les serruriers, etc. Vous les verrez, je pense, assez rapidement. Voilà, là, c'est tous les angles à l'intérieur sont faits, là, on appelle en Tunisie l'aile d'hirondelle. La symbolique de l'hirondelle, elle va vers le ciel à la rencontre des anges, et en même temps, l'hirondelle, tous les ans, revient à son nid. Et régulièrement, on ne va pas dans notre nid, c'est le sien, où elle revient par fidélité. Voilà les carreaux de céramique qu'on a fait réaliser à la main. C'est des carreaux du XVIIe siècle des palais de Tunisie. Donc, et ça nous permet d'avoir une ouverture très belle et surtout un tapis très beau qui s'ouvre à eux. pour changer de la décharge. Voilà, alors là aussi, tous les arbres, dont les jasmins, sont traités comme des arbres. On leur met des titeurs pour qu'ils puissent tous être coupés, arrondis, pour donner des colorations très belles, et pas les mettre simplement comme grimpants sur le mur. Voilà, les bougainvilliers. Alors, les bougainvilliers choisissent des bougainvilliers très rouges, symbolisant le sang qui coule dans le corps, qui est très rouge, pas un sang mort qui devient presque marron. C'est aussi donc la symbolique du corps en vie. Voilà, là, on est devant les premiers grenadiers. Voilà, alors, la symbolique de la grenade. Il y a de chaque, alors, c'est de grandes allées. La première allée est complètement faite avec des oranges amères. C'est l'amertume de l'orange. En même temps, on fait de la confiture. En même temps, on fait ce qu'on appelle l'eau de fleur d'oranger. En arabe, on dit mazhar, l'eau de la chance. Deuxième allée, c'était les grenadiers. Regardez, ça, j'étais absent au moment où on m'a mis 56 corps avant la fin de travaux. Je les ai conservés là jusqu'à qu'on finisse, qu'on les mette dans les tombes que vous allez voir. Ah, tout ça, c'est les fameux 56 qui ont été jetés par la mer et je ne voulais pas qu'ils les emmènent à la décharge. Donc j'ai dit, ramenez-la là, je m'arrangerai pour les enterrer après dignement. Voilà, là vous voyez, donc il y a beaucoup de bruns, et là c'est les fosses communes. Quand j'ai interdit, et je me suis dit avec le maire, on interdit maintenant de jeter les corps, donc ils ont fait quelques fosses communes, et après on a rattrapé les corps pour les ramener. Donc vous voyez, les migrants ont beaucoup travaillé sur ce lieu, et vous verrez les détails des tombes. C'est un ami qui est entrepreneur et un ami qui est avec lui. Vous voyez les tombes comme elles sont faites. Là, elles ne sont pas encore couvertes parce qu'en fait, sur tout le sol, j'ai mis une grande bâche plastique parce que la mer n'est pas loin pour que l'eau ne remonte pas. Et toutes les tombes vont être étanchisées par un ciment spécial comme des ciments de piscine pour que l'eau ne remonte pas dans les corps. Les corps eux-mêmes seront dans des poches et des bâches totalement étanches. C'est-à-dire que si jamais les parents viennent un jour chercher les corps, ils seront impeccables et intacts dans leur sac. Là, je suis en train de prendre le dessin pour faire ce qu'on appelle le témoin, shahd, le témoin pour mettre dessus les prélèvements ADN, parce que j'ai mis une grande morgue à l'intérieur du lieu. J'ai mis aussi des tables de prélèvement d'ADN. On a d'autres personnes qu'on a préparées à le faire. Voilà, ça c'est la garde nationale. Voilà comment on ramène les corps, malheureusement, parce que ça passe toujours par le procureur, le médecin légiste et la garde nationale, donc ils ramènent les corps. Voilà, alors... Je vous passe les détails, les autres, je les ai totalement zoomés, et j'ai mis 12 vignes, 6 vignes de chaque côté, symbolisant les 12 apôtres autour de Jésus-Christ. Donc c'est aussi la part donc, chrétienne dans la structure du jardin. Et voilà, donc là il y a des bonnes méditations, on peut prendre le thé, on peut discuter, les ouvriers manger leur couscous tous les vendredis ici. C'est plus un lieu de vie, un parc plutôt qu'un cimetière. Vous voyez, il y a 5 oliviers plus petits qui symbolisent les 5 piliers de l'islam. Shahada, Salat, Som, Zakat ou Hajj. Donc c'est la symbolique aussi de ça. Voilà, ça j'ai pu obtenir un olivier de 130 ans, symbolisant l'arbre de paix et qui ouvre l'entrée du lieu. Voilà donc le grand olivier installé juste dans l'axe, juste dans la truc. Voilà la salle de prière, et de chaque côté, à droite et à gauche, symboliquement, c'est 2 stèles des Koraichi qui viennent du Caucase du XIIe siècle. C'est des descendants donc de Mohammed aussi, et c'est le Caucase, il y a beaucoup de Koraichi qui m'ont permis d'avoir ces 2 stèles, de les mettre pour veiller comme des talismans sur les morts. Voilà la porte d'entrée, et vous verrez tout le temps, il y a des bandes d'assises méditation, la salle de prière. Voilà, détail des stèles dans le Caucase, donc où on a pris donc, les 2 autres stèles, qui sont celles d'un roi et de son fils, XIIe siècle. Là, c'est l'appartement du gardien, réservoir d'eau, après salle de prélèvement et la morgue, et les pierres blanches symbolisent des tombes encore vides qui n'ont pas de corps, pour ne pas ouvrir une tombe déjà occupée. Voilà le détail d'archi. Ça, c'est la morgue, malheureusement, c'est une morgue électronique, on peut mettre beaucoup de corps dedans, plutôt de les laisser pourrir. Ça, c'est les appartements donc, des gardiens et des trucs. Les sanitaires, les lieux aussi de méditation. À côté, vous voyez même le sol est nettoyé, par exemple que le lieu soit tout le temps. Là, c'est le premier secrétaire de l'ambassade de Russie, parce que j'ai ramené du Caucase, et c'est un pays fédéré à la Russie, donc des stèles pour voir où elles ont été installées, et donc le remercier. Ça, c'est l'entrée principale. L'UNESCO, donc ils ont mis le drapeau sur le lieu, donc il est protégé par l'UNESCO. Ça, vous voyez les arrivées de migrants. J'ai vu tout à l'heure, la collègue, elle a passé une image aussi des arrivées des migrants. Ça, c'est Audrey Azoulay avec le maire donc, de la ville, avec une survivante qui a vécu avec sa mère. Et là, pardon, je reviens en arrière, 2 secondes. Là, c'est, pardon, 2 secondes. Je suis en train de sauter toutes les images, je suis nul. C'est le grand rabbin de Djerba, c'est l'imam et c'est l'archevêque de Tunisie. Je voulais que les trois religions, qu'ils aient une prière des trois religions monothéistes dessus. Voilà, les tombes commencent à se construire comme celles de mes ancêtres dans le désert. Voilà, et chaque fois on met la plage où on a trouvé le corps, la femme est habillée d'une robe noire, enterrée telle date. Voilà, alors là, ce qui est plus grave, je vais vous lire cette chose extraordinaire qui a été envoyée par le médecin légiste de Sfax. Et depuis 3 mois, il a 80 corps et la population refuse qu'ils soient enterrés à Sfax. Ce qui est terrible à entendre, mais c'est une réalité. Alors le médecin écrit au président du Croissant Rouge et lui dit, le président du Croissant Rouge répond au docteur légiste. Bonjour docteur, nous voulons vous aider à inhumer à Jargis les corps des 80 migrants qui gisent toujours à votre service depuis plusieurs mois. Donc, le peintre plasticien Rashid Qureshi veut financer l'opération, il veut vous contacter pour finaliser l'opération. Voilà son WhatsApp, bien à vous, Moujisri, etc. Vous voyez jusqu'à quoi on arrive. Et malheureusement, quand Erdogan a tapé sur la table en Europe, on lui a donné des milliards. La Tunisie n'a pas un centime. Elle est dans une situation économique terrible. Donc, je me retrouve, moi, artiste, à faire un cimetière, ce qui est anormal, totalement anormal. Je pense, et quand récemment le pape François, dans son discours, a dit qu'il n'y a pas une tombe autour de la Méditerranée, je lui ai envoyé personnellement, j'ai dicté une lettre pour lui dire, mon père, je vous annonce simplement qu'il y a plus de 800 tombes déjà construites, malheureusement occupées au sud de la Tunisie. Donc c'est un pays qui accueille et qui fait des tombes. Et qu'ailleurs, malheureusement, c'est des fosses communes. Voilà, même les plaques, je les ai payées et mises dans la ville pour indiquer ce lieu, que ce soit un lieu de mémoire fondamentalement important. Voilà. Et alors là, je vais être rapide. Le maire, le président du Croissant Rouge et moi-même, on est sur la décharge. Je suis en train de leur expliquer comment je vais m'en occuper, comment je vais la traiter, et ça va devenir un lieu de mémoire. Et ça ne sera plus une décharge publique. Vous voyez, alors là, en Tunisie, vous voyez la flèche rouge qui indique le lieu, puisqu'on est dans le golfe de Gabès. Et là, j'ai lancé un second projet de cimetière sur la dernière des îles des Canaries, qui s'appelle l'île Fuerteventura, où il y a beaucoup de cadavres qui arrivent du Sahara, qui arrivent de Mauritanie, qui arrivent du Sénégal et des pays derrière le Sénégal. En fait, l'idée, c'est de faire la jonction jusqu'à l'île de Gorée, où malheureusement partaient des millions d'esclaves, et faire cette jonction pour que personne n'oublie que ces temps terribles qu'on vit, c'est des temps abominables, où l'Occident qui a saccagé notre continent continue à le faire, et pas un centime pour ça. Ça, c'est le plan du futur lieu à l'île Fuerteventura, c'est le plan dessiné par moi rapidement. Voilà le futur lieu qu'on pense faire sur l'île Fuerteventura. Et pourquoi ? Parce qu'ils se disent berbères, pas espagnols, et surtout, ils ont retrouvé là-bas une citerne d'eau à l'ancienne, comme sur l'île de Djerba, qui date du temps d'Ulysse. Donc il y a 7 citernes d'eau, et vous verrez que le lieu risque un jour d'être célèbre et aussi important, un lieu de mémoire. Voilà, merci de votre écoute.
Thank you. So we do have half an hour for Q&A and comments, and thank you to the panelists for these brilliant presentations and inspiring too. And I think there are microphones stationed around. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you so much for both a sobering and uplifting panel. So I will start with Rashid Qureshi, and I'm going to do that in French to facilitate. Bon, je vois votre projet, c'est moi qui parle ici, qui est très encourageant, mais je me demande dans le futur, si vous êtes bombardé par plus de corps et qu'il y a des compagnies multinationales qui vous apportent de l'aide financière, comment est-ce que vous allez naviguer ce paradoxe? Parce qu'on voit aussi que ce sont des compagnies internationales avec l'Europe et l'Ouest qui qui provoque un peu cette migration-là. Donc, comment est-ce que vous allez naviguer ça? Le paradoxe qu'on voit un peu à l'horizon. So the second point is for Zahid. I really buy into your rhetoric and the argument that you're making between the market and the art. But what I would like you to say more about is, what if you were to think about neoliberalization as opposed to neoliberalism? Because when we think about the statement of aims of the Montpellier society, and even if we were to go back to 1934, during the birth of neoliberalism, we see that there is a different ideology that is not always translated on the ground with neoliberalization. So can you say more about that if we were to disambiguate neoliberalism and neoliberalization?
J'ai une fille qui est gravement malade. Vous avez laissé des économies en disant le jour où je disparaîtrai de cette vie, au moins ma fille ne sera pas sans rien. Donc c'est les économies d'une vie de plus de 60 ans de travail. Je les ai non seulement mis totalement dedans pour ne pas avoir un centime de quiconque. C'était pour moi ne pas avoir à rendre compte à quiconque. Et en plus, carrément, je vous le dis entre nous, j'ai pris un crédit bancaire que je dois rembourser. Et c'est pas fini. Donc pour moi, je sais qui a saccagé l'Afrique actuellement. On le sait tous. On a bien vu. M. Bernard Lévy, M. Sarkozy, M. Tony Blair, M. Cameron, pour dire leur nom. Okay? Moi, je suis artiste, je n'ai rien à foutre de leurs histoires. Mais ceci dit, personne ne leur court derrière. Aujourd'hui, on voit ce qui se passe en Ukraine. La planète entière est sans dessus-dessous. Okay? La Syrie, personne n'a bougé pour les Syriens. Personne n'a bougé pour les Yémen. Personne ne bouge pour n'importe qui. Aujourd'hui, les armements vendus par Dassault, par Thomson, par Lagardère, et je peux citer une longue liste de gens qui ont pris des milliards, et tous ces armements ont été pris dans les arsenaux de Libye, sont en train de génocider toute l'Afrique. Donc, moi, je n'ai pas le temps d'attendre, ni de dire à quiconque. J'essaie de faire mes moyens. Si chacun, comme disait mon ami Perabi, que Dieu son âme, tu vois, que chacun fasse une goutte d'eau pour éteindre l'incendie de la forêt, c'est déjà ça. Ça a été ma part. Je ne sais pas si j'ai répondu à vous.
Thank you for your question. I just want to make sure I understood it correctly. The disambiguation between neoliberalism and neoliberalization, and what you have in mind, the weaponization of financial markets by the West in Latin America and Africa, that's what you're referring to? Yes, absolutely, okay. Yes, I think that distinction is very critical when one is considering the history of neoliberalism itself. But I also think it can sometimes blind us from the way finance capitalism is also weaponized within the West to erode citizenship as well. So I wouldn't want to disambiguate completely as well. Still, at the same time, it does what the questions it would raise to think of those two processes differently would be, for example, how is neoliberalization connected to Cold War economies, and what the crises of sovereignty that's associated with neoliberalization in Africa and Latin America is very different from the crisis of sovereignty in the West, and I think that's what I would want each to think through. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Here. Thank you. My question is, again, Zahid, to you, and maybe then to Ayesha. I was wondering, especially because Ayesha mentioned that the brown Atlantis, I like the framing, Ayesha, and I was wondering, and you said the cartography is unmappable. So I imagine it's a possibilities of different oceans that meet and the littorals that inform the conjunctures. But within this brown Atlantis, it might almost cover majority of the world, and not only in density, but also in head count, as well as in various World Bank decided metrics of poverty, growth, development. So in fact, it could as well be any color which could represent this majority, right? The whole idea of colorized identity, which then complicates much of the notions, and then probably gives rise to certain, I'm sure you have thought through it, but I was also thinking, in addition to the brownness or the brown texture of this, what is going on there more? Rather, it's for me, it's just a democratic ethos which is representative of this certain morality. And Zahid, this what our friend Anjali commented about this diversity as a bourgeois category, but then also this is giving space to certain identities which otherwise would not have, and eventually those identity activists are weaponizing that to then, in many ways, I think it's a contradiction within the neoliberal faith. And the titans of neoliberalism are not necessarily the Friedman and the old schools, but also the ones who might profess a certain liberal thought, which might not always be. And I think that's a very a terrible precedent. It's almost frightening, because there's various layers of identities, whichever you call, religious, and I'm not opposing identities. I'm not opposing ethnic, sexual, caste-based identities, but also how those neoliberal cleavages then add on to our debate to have an intra-group conversation than having a intergroup revolution, if you will.
Yeah. So I can start. I think how you've sort of introduced your question is really on point, because actually the cartographic impulse itself is such a violent impulse, right? To say something is mappable is to say something is excavatable through a kind of rationality, right? So you evacuate the kind of, for lack of a better term, the use value, the lived realities. It's turned into a kind of set of vectors or diagrams. So I would say that it is unmappable because of a density, but it's also, the act of mapping is qualitatively different from a lived reality. And there's a kind of epistemic violence in just the mapping gesture. And I guess by extension I would say that, these two terms, Black Atlantis and Brown Atlantis, are sort of placeholders for sort of multi-year projects, and even if you look at it from any perspective, they kind of fall apart. So, for example, even if you look at histories of indentureship, of course, histories of indentureship is not only people from the South Asian subcontinent; it's peoples from East Asia as well, and also the intermingling of peoples from both these parts of Asia in the Caribbean world, for example. So I would say that you're right on point. For me, in terms of thinking of a title, it's a placeholder, but I think the placeholders immediately sort of collapses. The initial project, Black Atlantis, was to sort of take this history of transatlantic slavery below the water, which is now actually, thankfully, something that we see discursively happening quite a lot. This is a connection that we understand, and we also understand it's not a great leap of mind to sort of connect Mediterranean migration to transatlantic slavery, which again sort of, challenges this distinction as well of different races. So I guess I would agree with you, and I would sort of say that the the impulse of naming is really at once the impulse of the cartographic, which is reductive. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying I agree with you.
Thank you for that question. There are a few ways to address that. One is, on the one hand, of course, neoliberalism does create opportunities for certain kinds of identities, even through its fetishization of diversity, etc. On the other hand, identity is a trap, as we know, as we well know. Nevertheless, I think you're onto something here, but the question that you're onto, I think, is an age-old question about politics, is that how does one use available positions for one's activism and to undo the structure that made that position possible. In some ways, that's the double bind of the artworks, too, that I'm talking about. And I think it's a good question because it's not answerable. And I think it's, you know, perhaps one would need to consider how does one do projects of sort of culture jamming using the very sort of language of neoliberal diversity and multiculturalism, but for practices that operate against the kind of release valve mechanism that these identities are supposed to serve. And I think that would be a major question if I were an activist, which I'm not a good one, that's why I'm an academic. Thank you.
For Zahid again, actually, and probably a good way to just go forward with that there's no answer, and that maybe there is, because, you know, the double bind that you described was almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy of capitalist realism, that art cannot reveal the truth of the market as a lie, but it reveals or puts into sharp relief the conditions in which it is made, and those conditions are economic, neoliberal, market-led conditions. What if, I mean, I'm wondering, how do you imagine surplus in this equation? I don't mean economic surplus, I mean political surplus. And a very simple and easy example for that is censorship. If it is made under certain economic conditions in which things are made, it's not just about its creation, it's also about conditions of its being made to appear, conditions of its appearance and conditions of refusal of its appearance. And so censorship here not just being about obscenity or pornography or religious blasphemy, but even difference, the refusal of certain identities who create art to be shown in museums and exhibitions and things. And that is also a site where art gets negotiated. Censorship, I mean. So then the answer is really not so much that art is trapped in this paradox, but that maybe a certain discourse that only fits art into a neoliberal economic discourse refuses to see the answer, which is the surplus, the political surplus that art constantly produces.
I completely believe, I'm a believer in the surplus. So I think you're totally right about that. I also think that the surplus is the reason why the art gets made, but I also would be cautious about any sort of discourse of redemption as a result of the surplus, and I think that's where it can become too easy for us to think that because the art is critically reflexive, therefore it's operating against some of those conditions that it comes out of. So for me, I mean, I don't think the double bind is a trap as such, but I think it's actually a very sort of productive way for art to reimagine its possibilities. But yes, the political surplus is without that, it's hard to imagine the relationship between art and politics without that being possible at all.
Thank you. I might have to stay on this point because it's just too interesting. My question is about this paradox, and I'm struggling to articulate it a little bit because you're talking about neoliberalism and the paradox that might create in a system like that, but then you also talked about the entanglement of art with hegemonic power, which makes me think that perhaps that entanglement, besides the political system that supports it, will still exist, whether it's a neoliberal system or another system. I'm just hoping to understand this paradox a little bit more and wondering if it's really neoliberalism that we're trying to frame as the culprit?
Yeah, I don't think it is just neoliberalism. I think it depends. I think neoliberalism itself is unevenly applied around the globe, and so it can take other forms. But I think the larger point that I was trying to make is that art does, from the making of the pyramids to art installations anywhere around the world now, it has had an intimacy with domination and power, and patronage and authority. And it's inescapable. So I don't think that necessarily makes art hopeless as an endeavor, but I think it's very important to understand the possibility in which art gets created. Is sometimes, if we're thinking about art and politics, that possibility needs to be engaged with. And neoliberalism I took as an example, as this is the most recent turning in this dance between art and power, or the kind of very minuet, you could say, between art and power. Thank you.
I think there are a few more. I'm just worried not to impose a fixity, historical fixity on neoliberalism itself. And also I'm worried not to deny the broad spectrum of artistic practice, from the documentation to the reflexive to the subversive, through the deep symbolic act. I'm just worried that we don't stay on one edge of it and ignore the fact that a lot of artists, Rashid especially, who through the corporeal aspect of art subverts conventions of art making, extends them, and uses them to even do an archaeological work like he's just shown. So I'm just worried that we don't forget that art itself is not only in the province of documentary or self-reflexive, but in fact a deep engagement with conventions of making meaning and with also symbolisms. I think somebody has a mic. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, this is a question for Rashid Qureshi. Very moved by your project and by...
I'm not sure your microphone is on, because it's important it is, so you can...
Yeah, there's a switch. Iftikhar, if you have to switch it up.
Okay. It does. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Is it on now? Can you hear me? Yeah. So, question, or really a thought. Thinking along with Rashid's. On off. Okay. With your project. Very struck by your statement saying that we could not give these people dignity in life, and you want to give them kind of dignity in death. And I think it really both points to the state of the world, really, that we are living in, and it's a very sobering and project, and a very brave one, I would say, to take this on. One of the things that also I started thinking is that, at least in the Islamic world, there used to be the notion, the institution of the waqf, or the awqaf, right, where basically, which was a kind of a commons in which there would be institutions that would do good deeds that would actually last over time, beyond, and many of these, I know many of these waqf foundations were then kind of interrupted when the nation state came about and nationalized them and so on. But I'm wondering if a project like yours is amenable to that kind of a way of thinking about it in terms of its longevity.
C'est une très bonne question, parce que nous qui venons des pays musulmans, on avait ce système. Oui. On avait ce système qui a été saccagé beaucoup plus par les nouveaux dirigeants de nos pays que par la colonisation. C'est drôle à dire, parce que la colonisation n'a pas touché à ce système. Elle l'a laissé. Et cette forme de nouvelle laïcité ou d'un ordre de nationalisme à la manière du Ba'ath a été de balayer tout ce qui était les confréries soufis, et l'argent qui était donné par les gens pour les waqf, même après leur mort, servait à protéger les pauvres, les orphelins, etc. Donc, ce qui se passe aujourd'hui, c'est qu'on s'est fait déstabiliser. Je cite le cas de mon pays, l'Algérie. On a même nationalisé les biens waqf. On a nationalisé les biens des confréries. Ça a été terrifiant. C'est-à-dire que tout le monde s'est retrouvé orphelin. Nous, dans ma famille, quand on se mariait, on ne faisait pas un mariage. Il y avait 40, 100, 200, 300 mariés. Et c'est la Zawiya qui prenait en charge, pour les plus pauvres, les mariés avec même les familles les plus riches. Et on était sur le même pied d'égalité. Les circoncisions, la même chose. Les enterrements, la même chose. Aujourd'hui, on est totalement déstabilisé. On a passé l'enfer de 10 ans de terrorisme. L'Algérie, on était isolé de la planète entière. Et on a subi ceux qui étaient payés, financés, armés. Ce n'est pas la peine que je cite les noms, vous les savez plus ou moins tous. Ça a été infernal, c'était l'enfer pour nous. Et après, le pouvoir, avec l'arrivée du président Bouteflika, lui s'est rendu compte, même si on n'a pas fait le chemin de l'Afrique du Sud, qui a jugé les gens qui ont tué les autres. En Algérie, on n'a jugé personne. Les gens sont descendus des montagnes ou des villes avec leurs couteaux encore pleins de sang, sont rentrés chez eux. L'État les a même aidés, c'est pire, l'État les a même aidés à monter des petites affaires, à avoir des licences de pompe d'essence et des choses comme ça. L'essentiel, c'est qu'ils arrêtent de tuer. Donc aujourd'hui, tu croises l'assassin de ton père, de ta mère ou de ta famille ou des viols, devant toi, tu n'as pas intérêt à le toucher. Donc on a fait juste une forme inverse. Aujourd'hui, les confréries commencent à se rouvrir, à se remettre en place, et j'espère que ça va durer longtemps. Ça nous permet vraiment d'avancer avec plutôt le respect et l'amour des autres. Je cite juste un cas précis. Moi, ma famille est venue de la Mecque au 7e siècle. Elle est allée de la Mecque à Médine, etc., Jérusalem, le Caire, Benghazi, Tripoli. Elle a construit la ville de Kérouan. Et de là, ils sont rentrés dans le sud donc, de l'Algérie. Une autre partie a fait le chemin inverse. Ils ont fait la Mecque, Basra à Bagdad, Tabriz en Iran. Ils sont installés au Daghestan aujourd'hui. Il y a une jonction, et aujourd'hui, la question, il y a Ahl el-Bayt, il y a une fondation très importante qui aide même dans un pays qui a été communiste. Donc elle vit encore et elle travaille. Donc les stèles qui sont venues, c'était comme une présence des descendants de Mohammed qui protègent les chrétiens, les bouddhistes, les animistes, tous les gens qui sont au cimetière sans distinction. C'est un grand symbole. C'est depuis le XIIe siècle. C'est comme ça qu'on a toujours vécu. Et j'espère qu'on vivra nos derniers jours de la même manière que le don, l'amour de l'autre, la fraternité et la paix.
You can take one more if anyone's keen to. No? Well, I want to thank you for the afternoon, but also to especially thank the panelists for giving us some compelling and intriguing presentations of their thoughts and their works. And thank you too, Bouchra. And I hope we all have a good afternoon. Thank you.